Hello and welcome to Frame to Frame, part of the We Made This podcast network. We are the podcast that take two seemingly unconnected films and slam them together like a European's head and a brick wall. I'm Andy Williams,
I'm Sean Wilson.
and that tickled you, didn't it? And
Can I just say I'm laughing at the absurdity of that? Okay, that's an ironic laugh. I want to make that very, very clear from the start. So,
hey,
well,
you and your views is entirely up to you.
yeah.
So this week we're going to be looking at thespians that have turned action stars. So people that were very, very serious, and either that or musical earlier on in their career, and then moving into action films, as the theme says. So Sean, what are your thoughts on this theme?
Well, what we're basically talking about are inverse career trajectories in which what one would normally expect is that the younger actor would be the type to bust heads in a violent or action-packed movie, and then normally as actors get older, they kind of develop this other stream where they grow into these paternal sort of sage roles, like filled with more gravitas. In the two instances that we've chosen, it's kind of gone the other way. More specifically, in the second example, and I believe, I think you ought to introduce them before we go any further, just to give it a bit of context. So,
Yeah, so the first film we're going to be looking at is the 2000 film X-Men that was directed by Bryan Singer, and the second film we're going to look at is the 2008 film known over here as Taken. It's also titled 96 Hours Somewhere in the World. It's also titled The Hostage Somewhere in the World, and that was directed by Pierre Morel. So we're going to be looking at those two. So we've got, basically, in Taken, we've got Liam Neeson. And in X-Men, we've got Patrick Stewart, we've got Sir Ian McKellen, and we've got Hugh Jackman.
yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is with Hugh Jackman is that I looked this up in relation to X-Men. This was Hugh Jackman's third movie, and he was cast 3 weeks into filming. They originally meant to get Dougray Scott in to play that role, and so Hugh Jackman, I think, is kind of counter to the theme of what we're saying, because Hugh Jackman wasn't established enough to have any kind of career to go from one career to another. But certainly Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, it's just definitely.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, Hugh Jackman was pretty big on stage. He was very very known as a theatre actor, and specifically as a musicals actor. You know, he was very established. Australia and Sydney is akin to like the West End or Broadway. You know, he'd been in some huge productions. These include the Beauty and the Beast, Sunset Boulevard, Oklahoma, Carousel. You know, he was a well-known stage actor within that world, but to make that transition is, like you say, it's only his actual third film.
I just want to nuance that. Big stage star, but no one knew him from films. Absolutely no one knew him from films. Whereas you look at the likes of Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, two of Britain's most celebrated thespian Shakespearean actors, and the really interesting thing was in X-Men. I mean, obviously Patrick Stewart had obviously long been associated with Star Trek, but you take two actors who have this incredibly stately, almost like regal bearing, and you put them in this audience-friendly popcorn mainstream context. And as I said, it's almost like the inverse of a lot of the stuff that they had done before. And then obviously the year after, Ian McKellen found a whole new audience, didn't he? He went off to do Lord of the Rings. But
Well,
yeah.
yes. Yeah, I mean, you know, in terms of specifically in McKellen's career, the amount of films he did prior to X-Men versus the amount of films he's done after X-Men, I think it comes about halfway into his actual career, which is slightly strange. But because he's so well known as a Shakespearean actor, I actually had the good fortune of seeing Sir Ian McKellen's Misfortune. I had tickets to see a production of King Lear that he was playing King Lear, but it turned out that day he had taken a fall and was unable to perform the actual play. So he came out onto the stage, and he was hobbling, he had crutches, he came and sat down, and he just told stories for about an hour and a half. He did bits of Shakespeare just from the top of his head, and it was beautiful. He then, about a year later, embarked on a tour around the UK where he was doing that sort of thing. So I like to feel like I saw the work in progress of that. And in addition to it, we also managed to get tickets to see King Lear again with him in it. So that was fantastic. But anyway, we've moved massively away from the. We're discussing the theme, but we're not discussing the films.
The film,
So
yeah.
why don't we actually start by looking at the film? So, because X-Men in itself is really, really interesting. So it was released in 2000. It was directed by Bryan Singer. Now, we're not going to go into the sort of allegations of harassment that have happened subsequently with Bryan Singer, but we are going to look at the comic book movie landscape as a whole within the year 2000. So, other than Blade and the Batman movies that had happened sort of a few years prior, there wasn't really a market for a comic book movie in Hollywood. Comic books were still being sort of frowned upon. Kevin Smith has told many stories about, they Hollywood viewed him as one of them, and comic book writers viewed him as one of them as well. But there was very us and them sort of mentality for it, and I think that you can kind of tell looking back. I mean, we're talking about a film that's 20 years old. You can kind of tell that within the writing that this has been written for a film, not by people that were in and absorbed with the comics the way that comic writers are. But the way that the landscape was at that point, there was no Marvel movie. There was no real precedent for a DC movie. An Aquaman film would have been a joke at this point. And it happened that around about the mid-90s, Marvel needed to make some money, and they sold off the rights to some of their biggest titles. And this, specifically X-Men, proved that there was the ability to make big budget action films out of the comic properties that people had. So, I mean, a couple of years later, we had the first Spider-Man movie, and then things really began to kick off from there. But I think that the film in and of itself is massively interesting, because what it does is it takes the allegories that were already built into the story. So X-Men started life as an allegory for the Black Panther movement and racism within America. The whole, you have to register, that we're being treated as subhuman, and we're being frowned upon by the quote unquote normal people. And do you know what I mean? The mutants being seen as black people, and then the non-mutants being seen as the white man that's trying to repress them. So that's already been built into that. But what I think Bryan Singer did as well was bake into it an idea of sort of the AIDS crisis and homophobia. And I think that that's really prevalent within specifically this first film, because you can see the act that people have to come out as being a mutant. Like, there's no way we can know just by looking at you. You have to physically come out as that. And I think that it's to have baked that sort of thing into this bigger film and this bigger budget film at this specific time. This cost $75 million. It's no small change, and the special effects shots are, obviously looking at it now, quite dated. And I think that the fact that you have all of this just as a thematic level shows how much it really works, and it still sort of stands up 20 years later. But I mean, Sean, what did you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting watching it again, because I think it's probably the first comic book movie that actually dealt with high-minded ideas, quite serious ideas. I mean, you did mention Blade that had come out 2 years before. Blade was rated 18 for its gore, but Blade didn't intellectualize its ideas necessarily. It was the nature of the violence that made that an 18, whereas X-Men was a 12. But I struggle to think of any comic book movie prior to this that actually put like popcorn action in the service of, as you've said, of outsiderness, of xenophobia, of the fact that it begins at the very it starts with a sequence at Auschwitz. I mean, I remember seeing this at the cinema when I was 13 and having a basic understanding of what World War II was, and that's not the way I expected the film to begin at all. It's a very, very dark, toiling, anguished opening that introduces you to Eric Lenscher, Magneto, soon to become Ian McKellen later on in the story. And I like the way that the movie unashamedly, grapples with these themes. I think it's very interesting, and I think that clearly it worked. It inspired the huge X-Men franchise, which went through varying degrees of intelligence and engagement. It's just, yeah, I think.
Let's not
I
mention
mean,
X-Men 3.
no, X-Men 3 or X-Men Apocalypse, or what was the not X-Men Days of Future
Dark
Past,
Fate.
X-Men Origin.
No, that was
Yeah, Dark
Terminator.
Fate. Yeah. X-Men Origins Wolverine, which I think is the worst one. So it's a checkered franchise, but the reason why this first one works is because you've got not just Hugh Jackman, who's sensationally good as Wolverine, again, as I mentioned, a very, very late replacement for Dougray Scott, but because you've got two incredibly accomplished British theatrical and screen actors, Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, really rolling this quite clunky expositionary dialogue off the tongue as if it was like a Shakespearean monologue. And if you didn't have two actors as accomplished as this, I think it would actually be quite awkward. It would be quite awkward and quite silly. But they invest this real sense of purpose into it, bearing in mind that a lot of it. I mean, Ian McKellen basically has to sort of fly around with a bucket on his head and a cape flying out of his back, and you kind of think any other actor would have to work really, really hard to sell that. And I've no doubt he did work hard on the set, but he makes it look effortless, and you really do get a sense at the center of the story, thanks to these two actors, that these two characters, Xavier, Patrick Stewart, and Lenscher, Magneto, Ian McKellen, they were once friends, and now differing ideals have now split them down the middle. And because Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart are friends in real life, I think they bring that chemistry, that believability to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does lift the film up. And I think that the act of doing that, the act of getting those actors in it, really showed to the entire world that what could be written off as ostensibly juvenile or silly can actually have a real sense of classiness, a real sense of a heft to it. I mean, we take it for granted now. I mean, we see famous actors, very celebrated actors, popping up in comic book movies all the time. It really wasn't done prior to this film, and it's very, very easy, I think, to take for granted. I mean, it's quite depressing to think there are kids alive nowadays who wouldn't have even been born when the first X-Men movie came out, and I was 13 when it came out in the cinema, which is more than enough to make me go and cry in a corner. It's just like...
There's people who can drive now and still wouldn't have been alive when this was out.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite, yeah, but it's a terrific film, isn't it?
That set you off crying. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Sorry, it doesn't take very much.
Yeah, So I similar to you. I didn't watch it in the cinema. I was too young to get in. That's the
no.
the
You
kicker
didn't
there.
just throw that in there. You didn't just stick the knife in there like that. That's incredible. You just took Wolverine's claws and you just went. Yeah.
Sorry, facts is facts. Yeah. So I caught up with it a little bit later. So I remember what year was X2? I vaguely
2003, 2003, I think that was. X2.
So yeah, I was old enough to get in to see that. The Last Stand, I absolutely remember, and I remember howling with laughter when Vinnie Jones delivers his Juggernaut line, because it's supposed to be serious, and it really
Can
isn't.
I do it? Am I allowed to do it?
Please don't. Please don't.
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch! Like that. It's literally like that.
Yeah. So many things wrong with that film. But anyway, let's not get into what's wrong with The Last Stand, because we'll be here all day. I think you really hit the nail on the head in saying that there was the lived-in friendship between Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, because there is also that friendship with Xavier and Eric Lenscher, Magneto. And I think that is what carries the film. And similar to, I found myself more this time watching it sort of years later, understanding a lot more as to where Magneto was coming from. Similar to a way of, and I'm going to draw the comparison with Black Panther here, of Killmonger in Black Panther. You can understand his point of view. You may not necessarily agree with it, but you can understand why he's reacting the way he's reacting. And I think that that's a really interesting comparison to look at the two and go, you know what, you've actually kind of got a point. And I think that's a real strength of the writing of X-Men. Well, Black Panther too, but we're not talking about that right now. But the writing in X-Men is to have that as a thematic link between them of, you know what, he kind of has a point. And whilst, yes, I don't necessarily agree with it, I imagine it goes back to the days of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. You know, these two people that are ostensibly looking for the same thing. One of them is looking for, well, is more willing to have blood spilled as a result of it. But hey, but there I am complimenting the writing within the film, and it delivers so po-faced one of the worst lines I think I have ever seen delivered. And I think you know what line I'm talking about. Do you know what happens to a toad when it gets struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else. I mean, Halle Berry's an Oscar winner. She has won an Oscar.
um,
Yeah, okay, a couple of years later. But I
yeah.
mean, you'd have another run at that. Surely you go, you know what? Not sure it works.
Have you heard the behind the scenes story about that though? We're going to invoke somebody else who's not very popular at the moment, Joss Whedon, because Joss Whedon apparently wrote that line. He contributed to the script, and apparently Joss Whedon wrote that line as if it was meant to be of being delivered with a bit of a shrug. Like, do you know what happens to toads when they get struck by lightning? Same thing that happens to everyone else. And then Halle Berry delivered it in this idiotically po-faced, portentous way. Obviously, one has to blame Bryan Singer for directing it like that. And then Joss Whedon apparently, well, what the hell? That's not how I wrote that line. No wonder it's silly. So it just shows how things can get mangled in translation. I mean, unfortunately, they didn't degrade Ian McKellen or Patrick Stewart with that line, because that just would have been really embarrassing. Like if that happened. So, yeah.
Well, maybe they might have made it work, but who knows? I mean, it's. I've constantly pointed to, whenever anybody's asked me sort of what's the one line that you think is most ridiculous in films or something along those lines, I will always point to that line in X-Men. But moving back to the development of X-Men, it was previously, this is another great what if, right? People started working on a film for X-Men really like in the 80s, in like 1980, mid 1980s. And the names that were linked with it at one point were James Cameron and Catherine Bigelow. Could you imagine a James Cameron X-Men? And we're moving into the world of Entourage here, where James Cameron directed Aquaman, starring our lead, Vincent Chase, which then went on to become the highest grossing film of all time. But a James Cameron X-Men movie in the 80s would have been great. But, you know, then it went through all sorts of different changes within the 90s and eventually ended up with the version that we've got.
I think it would have been quite hard edged. If it was the James Cameron of the 80s, I think it would have been quite hard edged and quite gritty. I think if he'd made it in the late 90s, it might have got a bit sanctimonious and preachy like Avatar did. But yeah, I would love to have seen what he did with it in the 80s. That would have been fascinating.
Or even Catherine Bigelow. I mean, a Catherine Bigelow X-Men film would have been very interesting, because although Rogue is front and center in the film, I mean, this is the first time we've mentioned Rogue, and she's probably the lead character. But although Rogue is front and center of the film, the fact is we've kind of mentioned Wolverine. We've definitely mentioned Professor X, and we've definitely mentioned Magneto. So, I mean, it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened with, you know, your Jean Greys or your Storms, or see who else might have been included in the film as well. But I've always thought that you could tell a lot by a person by asking them their favourite character of X-Men. So I'm now going to put you on the spot. Who is your favourite X-Men character?
Well, it's Wolverine, but it's largely because Hugh Jackman's performance is so brilliant. You look disappointed as we're recording it. People who aren't watching the video, you cast such a disappointed look there. Like, so who was I meant to say?
I mean, you could have picked someone not quite like obvious, but there we are.
Well, that's me, Mr. Obvious. It's entirely me. I
Yeah.
mean, Hugh Jackman is just, he's just a feral blast of energy. I can't believe that he'd only done 2 films prior to this, both in Australia, and he's so. And actually, that's another advantage that the film has got because he wasn't known for films. He didn't have that overbearing star iconography, like for example, someone like Tom Cruise might have had. Because if Tom Cruise had played that character, it would be like, well, that's just Tom Cruise with mutton chops and steel claws, and I don't buy it. But you don't have
I
that problem with Hugh
mean,
Jackman.
yeah. Thanks for bringing to mind Jack Reacher, the 6'5", 45-inch chest, ridiculous man.
I didn't mind the Jack Reacher films, but I haven't read the books,
That's
so
because
I'm
you've
not
not read the
loyal to them.
books. Yeah.
Yeah, So, but yeah, I think it's Which is, I mean, well, who's your favorite X-Men character then?
I'm going to throw you a curveball and say Gambit, just because I think he's awesome and he has like these card skills that are ridiculous. And I just loved him from uh, the old '90s cartoon, which is also now available on Disney Plus, similar to the X-Men films. So if you after you've watched X-Men and then after you've listened to this podcast, please go and check out the '90s TV series just because it's fantastic.
Weren't they supposed to be making a Gambit film with Channing Tatum, and it keeps getting delayed and pushed back and messed around? I don't think that's ever going to happen, is it? By the sounds of it.
Probably not. He's been championing the role in a similar way to Ryan Reynolds with Deadpool, and Deadpool is part of the X verse. And yeah, he's been trying to get one, but yeah, what can you do if studios don't think it's there? And frankly, the source material isn't as so clearly fitted to an actor as Deadpool and Ryan Reynolds is. So it, maybe one day we'll get one, but I'm not hugely confident now with the fact that the X-Men rights have reverted to Marvel. Now that Disney own Fox, therefore own the rights.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that we'll have these levels of spin-off films anymore. I think Deadpool, obviously, because wildly successful. I think they'll eventually try and work the X-Men into the MCU because that makes sense. But what that does do is it sort of takes away the competition as such. It loses the autonomy that the X-Men franchise could have had, but frankly, they did have and they wasted. So it's interesting to see what they do next. I mean, other than if you're looking through the X-Men films that they did, X2 for me is up there with Spider-Man 2 as one of the high watermarks of comic book movies.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah.
First Class, I loved. Days of Future Past, I loved. Um, but yeah, Dark Phoenix, Apocalypse, and The Last Stand, I could take or leave. Logan is just an absolute masterpiece. The Wolverine is kind of okay, and
I mean,
Origins Wolverine is awful.
Logan is great because it plays against the expectations of what but it strips out the buckets on the head, the capes, the overt superpowers. That's why it is so brilliant. It's a western. It obviously invokes Shane on more than one occasion, but once again, you put Patrick Stewart in it as the ailing Xavier, and it almost comes back full circle to the impact of his casting in the first X-Men movie. It's a reminder of what great actors can do to lift this material up, to really emotionally engage you in what's going on. Because going back to the first X-Men movie, there's a lot of groundwork to cover in a relatively short space of time, and I
Mhm.
think that pressure does show. I mean, these were some of the most famous comic book characters of all time. There'd never been, to my knowledge, a feature-length X-Men movie before this one. This was the first one, right? They hadn't even attempted any others they hadn't even done a TV version of it. Have they? I
No,
don't think.
so there was the animated series in the '90s, and that kind of helped sort of g this one along and get it to actually be made. Um, but no, as far as I'm aware, it is the first. It's the first live action version of X Men, as well as the clearly the biggest budgeted. This was the real shot that they had to try and take to prove the concept of a comic book movie. And look at the slew of comic book movies that we've had subsequently. And I don't just mean your Marvels and your DCs. I mean your Sin Cities. You've had all sorts of sort of things that you might not necessarily think of as comic book movies, like Wanted or Persepolis, or do you know what I mean? There's been so many, even Watchmen, which now is a DC property, but 300. There's everything that happened within that time between this coming out and the MCU being created was almost directly as a result of X-Men. It's even, you could argue, the MCU is a direct result of X-Men because the popularities grew and grew. And I think that gets lost in a lot of the conversations that you have about comic book movies, because the amount, you hinted at it, the heavy lifting that this film had to do is ridiculous, because it had to introduce the concept of mutants, it had to get the allegories that we've mentioned, and I think that you had to introduce each of the characters. And yes, certain people do get sort of brushed to the wayside, so you don't really get too much from Scott Summers, who was Cyclops. You don't really get.
All James Marsden does is literally hang around in the background wearing a pair of shades. You kind of feel quite bad for him, really, because his character has got awesome abilities.
Yeah, you don't really sort of investigate the fact that he is a character until the end of the film. He needs those shades. Like, if he opens his eyes, he's just going to go nuts.
He'll kill everyone. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like, that's barely sort of not really hinted at. And yeah, Jean Grey goes on to become, you look at The Last Stand once again, she goes on to become one of the most powerful mutants out there. And they do look at it in the Dark Phoenix storyline, which, just read the comics, don't bother watching the film. And there's little bits of some of the other characters, like Storm, but she has that truly awful dialogue. Mystique hints at a backstory when she says it was people like you that made me not want to go to school. I just think that the amount of heavy lifting that this had to do, and it does it very, very well.
I must admit, yeah, it does do it well. You do see the strain. I think you definitely do see the strain on it, because it's quite choppy, because it has to basically cut through a lot of individual origin stories within one film, and sometimes the transitions from one scene to another are very blunt, almost verging on hilarious. It's kind of, hang on a minute, how have we gone from that person over there to that person over there so abruptly? And this is what I'm going on about the fact that you need great actors to sell this material, because the idea of the kind of ensemble comic book movie template wasn't laid down at the time this film came out. This film practically invented it, and you can see they're trying to work the rules out.
Yeah.
And sometimes the way they work it out is quite ham-handed and quite, obviously quite silly. And there's a bit when Wolverine Logan first wakes up in the X-Mansion, Xavier's school, and Xavier basically takes him in his wheelchair through the school, introducing him to the concept of what Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters is. And it's basically just exposition. It's a huge exposition dump. But it helps that Bryan Singer kind of edits his way through the film. He edits his way through that sequence quite carefully. So you jump from Logan and Xavier in one location to another as the dialogue continues. So it's quite sharply edited as echoes of the editing of The Usual Suspects there, which Bryan Singer did. But it works because of Patrick Stewart. It all entirely because of him. And there are things that don't work. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Mystique there, because that idea of the full body CGI transformation was really extraordinary when this film came out. I think the only other film that had really been seen in was Terminator 2, which was 9 years before. But clearly the effects in this were more sophisticated in as much as the film came out later. But there were quirky little characters. I really like what Ray Park did with Toad. Obviously, Ray Park, who played Darth Maul in Phantom Menace. I thought he's not in it very much, but he gives it this kind of perverse weird, like sort of loose limbed sort of physicality. He's quite amusing. But what struck me about this first X-Men movie watching again is how horrific it is. It's dark. It's a lot about body horror,
It is.
and I think more so than what you got in the late ones, with the possible exception of Logan, which was obviously 15 rated and much more grown up. This is quite. It's about, like you mentioned earlier, the allegory for AIDS, the idea that it's adolescence, you're dealing with changes to your body that in some instances manifest as kind of mutant abilities. This film really goes into it. And there's the scene with Bruce Davison's character, Senator Kelly, who basically gets sort of turned into a mutant by Magneto. He's then he's then picked up by the X-Men.
He speeds up God because he's not working fast enough.
Yeah, and it's another classic scene. But Ian McKellen makes that frankly fatuous dialogue work, because that just would have been supremely idiotic from somebody else's mouth. And and then Senator Kelly's brought back, comes to the X-Men mansion, and he basically dies in front of Jean Grey. He basically swells up as a big blob of water and just basically just sort of evaporates. And it's quite horrific.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite, and I love how unashamed that is.
I remember in the early days of DVD having this film and watching that scene in slow motion to see how the CGI did that.
Yeah.
Because, we're again going to invoke James Cameron and look at the abyss with water moving and stuff. I just thought it was fascinating. But yeah, I think that when you consider it's actually packed all of the stuff that we've mentioned in, and it's less than 2 hours long. Like that's what's crazy. It manages to do it in a, yes, okay, there's points where it's choppy and there's points where it's aged, but it's still fun. It's still a good film, and it's still, for me, hangs together. And it was a rip roaring success. It grossed at just under $300 million. And when I mentioned it, it was budgeted earlier on at 75 million. That's a massive success considering the gamble that they took on it, and they actually managed to get it to pay off, which was fantastic. Also, I mentioned the MCU, and going back to how this was influenced by it. There was an associate producer on this film that was sort of trying to keep some of the mishaps that Bryan Singer was happening on his set. Someone was flown in to try and keep him in line, and that man was called Kevin Feige, who is now known as almost the godfather of the MCU. He's the producer, the oligarch, the overlord of the MCU. So, hey, he was involved at this point. But one thing that we haven't really mentioned about this film is the actress that plays Jean Grey, Famke Janssen, and she actually appears in our other film from this week. Complete coincidence, but she plays the wife of the European beating Brian Mills, who's played by Liam Neeson. I mean, I don't think I can describe this plot without breaking down somewhat. So, Sean, can you tell us all about Taken, please?
Plot thus: Liam Neeson goes to Paris and kills everybody. So I think there you have it. Actually, no. To give the film its credit,
it's not just Paris.
It's not just Paris. There's a little bit more nuance in that. Let me rephrase. Plot thus: Liam Neeson goes to Paris and kills everybody of Eastern European extraction. There you go. That's the plot. So that is Taken in a nutshell. Okay. So let's set about cracking that nutshell, shall we?
I mean, so to give it a little bit more nuance, so Liam Neeson plays Brian Mills, the ridiculously named, like it's like a boring name generator, isn't it? It's like someone's just gone, what? Let's think of the two most boring names possible. Brian Mills.
But that's why they've done it, haven't they? It's because no one called Brian Mills could stick electricity in somebody's legs and get information out of them, can they? Or maybe they can. That's you can tell that's clearly why they've done it.
Yeah, it is, and it's ridiculous. But yeah. So his daughter is the shortest possible version is she's planning to follow U2 around Europe on their tour, which I mean, that's a disaster movie in and of itself. Who follows U2 around?
I know, and like the whole concept of that, like following a rock group around, like what do you mean? Do you mean that you're going to go and sit outside the stadium in each of the cities that they're going in? Unless you've got a hell of a lot of money, you are not going to be seeing them at
Well,
every one of those stadiums. Like, so the concept just doesn't make sense
I
in and of
mean,
itself. Anyway,
her stepdad clearly does have a decent whack of change.
yeah.
Who is played, by the way, by Xander Berkeley, who was George Mason in series 1 and 2 of 24.
He's the one who crashed the plane to blow up the nuclear bomb. Yeah, see, tell me and you are completely clearly on the same page. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, spoilers to anyone that hasn't seen series 2 of 24.
Yes, sorry about
it
that.
came out in 2004. You've had your chance. So yeah, that was the most despicable thing about this film, was that she was actually planning to follow U2. Frankly, I'd rather be taken and sold to sex trafficking Albanians, because watching U2 once would be bad enough, but watching them multiple times, like, no, who's going to do that? That's ridiculous. It's the most unbelievable part of the plot. And anyway, her and her friend get taken, and we have the wonderful, like, me-malicious scene of Brian Mills telling people that he has a very particular set of skills, and then killing ensues. Luckily, he, plot manages to get him there very, very quickly, and he's given himself this ridiculously fake timeline of, I have to get it done within 92 hours. It's like, why? Just because
where does that come from? it's like he's almost pulls out like the Oxford Book of Kidnapping, and it's like, okay, 92 hours. Right, she's got 92 hours. There you go. You got to get her now. And it's like, okay, what?
We'll forget the 8 hours it takes to fly there. But anyway,
exactly.
Jet lag's apparently not a thing.
Yeah.
You don't get jet lagged if you're Brian Mills, apparently.
No.
And I mean, then he manages to follow the trail to try and find his daughter. And there's a scene where he's going through a car chase in a building site. I don't understand how we got there, but we did. And the one thing that I thought throughout that entire scene is really lucky they put their headlights on. Like, they were having this car chase through it, but at least we managed to get, like, we could at least see the cars, and they wanted to see where they were going. They clearly didn't want to crash into random lorries and tractors and stuff. But
I just think it's the classic thing of, like, it's quite funny on these building sites that every building that can be crashed into appears to be conveniently loaded with explosives, which looks really cool on film. So it's kind of like, like in old James Bond films, whenever any car went off a cliff in a James Bond film, it blew up. Like, okay, that car is not going to blow up. It will get mangled and things like that. But it's just just ridiculous.
I mean, at least in a car, you're guaranteed to have fuel, right? Whereas, in a building, not so much. But yeah, it's just ridiculous. Part of me thinks that they actually knew what film they were making, because there's certain bits where they really clearly lean into it. Because, like, there's that scene where he gets captured and they try and torture him and he manages to escape. And the guy opens the door, and we see just this long shot of the guy opening the door and just getting shot. And then Brian Mills coming out. And it's done in a very comical way. And it then begs the question of, do they know what they've made? Do they know that they've made a ridiculous film? Or were they trying to make a serious Bourne-like action film and completely mess it up?
It's a real conundrum, isn't it? Because I think that on some level, bearing in mind the utter stupidity of the film, you've got to perversely it generates some degree of admiration. It's so single-minded in its sense of stupidity that you've got to kind of give it some kind of grudging respect. I mean, literally, Liam Neeson goes to the French capital, headbutts, kicks, stabs, punches. All these evil Albanians all the way through it, and it's ruthlessly single-minded, and it is very much one of those 70s 80s throwbacks in which we're not going to let any sense of decency or morality or nuance get in the way of this kind of charging
or
bull
common
of a character.
sense.
Or common sense, yeah, exactly. Or reality, or intelligence, or anything get in the way of it.
Yeah, that's why we've got following you two around. Like,
yeah, I know. It's just crazy, isn't it? But I mean, it's just.
that's a
I
real
mean,
sticking point for me. I'm sorry.
yeah. There is a real just po-facedness about it, which I think I can't tell if that is actually deliberate or not. There's one scene where the fiendish French bureaucrat whom Brian Mills used to know, who's now gone evil, and then Brian finds out about it, and Brian comes round to have a very French meal with him and his wife, and then Brian ends up shooting her in the arm.
Isn't he called Jean-Claude?
He's called Jean-Claude. It's literally like, again, the Oxford Book of French names, Jean-Claude. Yeah, there we go. So it's kind of to go with the Oxford Book of Kidnapping. And in that scene, Brian Mills actually says the words when he shoots her in the arm. Poor wife, like collateral damage gets in the way. He goes, "It's just a flesh wound." It's like, right, you've just dropped a Monty Python quote. You've just dropped a Monty Python quote right in the middle of this violent scene. It's like, are they not aware? Probably not, because it was backed by French filmmakers. It's backed by Luc Besson. Maybe he's not up on his Python. I don't know. But like, if that was an English language filmmaker, you would not have the character say that. So it's just...
I don't know. Like, so this was co-written by Luc Besson and Robert Mark Kamen, and Robert Mark Kamen is the creator of Karate Kid. So maybe he knew. Maybe it was a deliberate Python reference that I actually didn't spot at the time. I was like, oh, okay. So my relationship with this film, I'd never seen the three Taken movies, and in prep for this podcast, I watched not only the first one, but I also watched the second one because I thought...
Oh, you didn't? No.
Maybe it adds a level of nuance and a level of detail to the character. No. Other than the fact that that his daughter can apparently drive like he can, despite not having passed her test, and she can run across rooftops as good as James Bond, and apparently it's fine to just wantonly throw explosion or grenades around Istanbul because no one cares.
And because I can use my super ears to penetrate the shockwaves and work out exactly like where you are. I mean, honestly, the second Taken makes the first Taken look like Citizen Kane in terms of its realism. It's I mean, and that's not saying very much, given that the first Taken has got, "I'll tear down the Eiffel Tower if I have to," and it's kind of like, blimey, okay, fine.
Well, yeah, she's not going to be in there. It's full of holes. You can see in there.
Exactly. She get out. She get down the lift. I kind of feel like we need to couch this in, given how this film is clearly hilarious. It hasn't stopped being hilarious in the years that it's come out. But Liam Neeson, right? So you got Liam Neeson, who was very fated for Schindler's List. Michael Collins, Kinsey, very, very, very well-established actor. He was actually in Krull right at the very beginning of his career, which everyone tends to forget. I mean, he was in the 1980s fantasy movie Krull, which was on TV the other day. Oh my God, that's bad. It's so terrible. But
I mean, we've even done another Liam Neeson film, have we not? On this podcast, didn't we do?
Oh, hang on. What was it?
I'm just trying to remember now. Didn't we do Darkman?
Yes, we did do Darkman. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. And that's probably... I mean, Liam Neeson had been in Darkman. He had been in The Phantom Menace. And he'd done a degree of action in Rob Roy, which I think is a brilliant film. I really like Rob Roy's, but it came out the same year as Braveheart. It's way better than Braveheart, largely thanks to Tim Roth as the baddie. But Liam Neeson hadn't done anything like this before, and it's going back to the phrase I used to thought, it's the inverse career trajectory. Before Taken came out, if you'd have said, "Oh, Liam Neeson is going to stick electrodes into a guy's legs and fry him," you'd laugh the person out of the room. You go, "Liam Neeson can't do that. He's like sensitive, like thespian actor, right? Like you can't."
You mean Oscar Schindler, right? He's
yeah.
I mean, he did. He was Ra's al Ghul, wasn't he, in Batman Begins?
This is true. Yeah. So there'd been
but
fragments
in the same. in the same year, he was the voice of literal God in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. He played Aslan.
Except Aslan didn't have a grudge against Eastern Europeans and didn't go charging through the sea.
That I'd watch. Taken, but with a lion. That would be amazing.
I just love seeing the deadpan reactions of all the French police, just these charging around the centre of the French capital.
But then the crazy thing is, after this, he did the A-Team. He was in Clash of the Titans. He did The Grey, which is the one with him and wolves. He did Unknown. It literally became a one-man genre, and they all kind of blend together. He did A Walk Among the Tombstones, Run All Night.
And
I think
non-stop, the one where he's on the plane, and he's got a more limited environment in which to beat people up, so it kind of enhances.
He also did The Commuter, which was him on a train, so similar.
Yeah. See, I don't know if people can notice there is a pattern coming here, which is all of those films are practically the same film. After Taken, he practically did the same film about 20 million billion times.
He did Silence after Taken, the Martin Scorsese sort of serious acting film.
In which he was meant to be Portuguese and he sounded Irish. It was quite distracting.
I mean, echoes of Sean Connery. That's what it was. He did A Monster Calls. Ordinary Love, I think, was really, really good and much underseen with Liam Neeson and Leslie Manville. That was after the Taken trilogy, but yeah, I think he literally became a one-man genre.
I just want to point out he also did Good Cop, Bad Cop in the Lego Movie, and he was just spectacularly good in that. So anyone who hasn't seen
I've seen that film so many times. I've played the game of that film with my son. He's exactly the right age for the Lego Movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you want hints on how to walk through the Lego Movie game, then please just get in touch. I'm more than happy to help.
Have you seen the B-roll of Liam Neeson recording those two voices? Because it's absolutely brilliant. You can actually see him in the studio. He goes, security footage found this. Boom! Hi, buddy. Would you like a glass of water? Too bad. Like that. You can actually see him in the studio just switching between those two voices, and you can see how much fun he's having with it, and it's absolutely brilliant. But anyway, we've got where were we? Well, we were talking about Taken, weren't we? So this is interesting.
I mean, yeah, ostensibly we were mocking Taken as much as anything else. It's I think it's deliberately designed to do that, but I say it with an inflection because I'm really not sure.
I'm going to hit you with a fact now. Did you know
that's new for the podcast?
I know. I normally absorb the facts. I don't give them. So did you know that in the early stages of production, this role was written for Jeff Bridges? Jeff Bridges was going to play this part.
I mean, I think Jeff Bridges is a bit too... Is the word... I think the word lumbering is probably a bit harsh, right?
I mean, but the thing is, I would have said that about Liam Neeson.
Is probably what I was thinking. Well, it takes a certain type of actor to look good running, and Tom Cruise does it, and I think Liam Neeson can do it.
I mean, in the second and third Taken movies, you can do it with the help of a very, very choppy editor, because the editing in the second and third movies is absolutely abominable. I mean, literally,
what car are we in? Who's driving which now? Who's hitting who?
There's literally a scene in the third one where he literally approaches a wooden fence and he has to jump over it to get away from the police. There are literally about 20 cuts in the sequence. It's like, cut approaching, over the other side, and it's like just honestly, if you're gonna do that, just get a decent looking stuntman and do it in about 2 or 3 edits and just get on with it. It's just absurd.
I mean, Simon Pegg did it in one as Sergeant Nick Angel. So
yeah, and then Nick Frost managed not to do it, which is one of the best sight gags ever.
And you know that Danny from from Hot Fuzz, you know he loves Taken. You know it's his favourite film
Yes.
of all time.
You ain't watched Taken, or you ain't watched Taken 2. You just imagine that going.
I mean, which one do you want to watch first?
Yeah, you are pulling my leg. I mean, just the Taken is just such a weird prospect, because again, you've got to love how just unreconstructed it is. I mean, all of the baddies they're all incredibly hairy. They're all incredibly greasy. They're all sitting around in these tenements. You know, they're getting girls drugged up. They're like selling. Like, okay, how have you actually got away with pitching this as a concept of a film? Because this is just so.
It's so racist.
It is.
It's
It's just
so racist. It's so ridiculous. Like
yeah.
we joked at the top of the podcast that a European's head's getting banged into a wall. This is the most Brexit movie I think I've ever seen. It's the advert for why don't you want to be in Europe anymore? Well, because they steal women and they sell them. Like, why would we?
I know.
It's just ridiculous.
It's obscene, and
Just an absurd film.
And then the scene on the boat at the end, where you think, okay, the portrayal of the baddies can't possibly get any more offensive. The main baddie is just so slovenly and so fat that he basically is reclining.
It's Jabba the Hutt. He's Jabba the Hutt.
He's Jabba the Hutt. He is, and it's absolutely absurd. And it's really interesting that that Liam Neeson, when he signed on to do this, thought that the film was going to bomb. He thought it was going to go straight to DVD. And I think he was as surprised as anyone, where it basically gave his career a completely new lease of life. It's like, oh, audiences want to see me as this character. I think he was genuinely quite shocked. And I mean, you and the rest of us,
I
Liam.
mean, yeah, it was a ridiculous hit. You bear in mind we were talking about with X-Men a $75 million budget and almost a $300 million gross. This was budgeted $25 million, so much, much lower. And it grossed $226 million. Like, that's a ridiculous return on investment. It was, I mean, like we said, it's birthed an entire genre of film similar to X-Men. That could have been our theme, you know, ridiculous action films that have. Well, this X-Men wasn't ridiculous, but action films that have birthed an entire franchise. And I mean, I have not seen Taken 3, mostly because it's not on Disney Plus the same way that Taken 1 and 2 were. I'm not in a massive rush, but at the same time, if it's stupid, why not?
No,
It's probably just as bad.
Slow that rush to an absolute crawl and then stop, okay? Because you'll save yourself a lot of pain, okay? Like an awful lot of pain.
Is it worse than X-Men 3?
Yes, a lot worse than X-Men 3. And God,
I'm intrigued.
Something. No, honestly, I didn't say it for you to be intrigued. This is going completely the wrong way now. So, I mean, it's just, I mean, if you thought that the Istanbul, the daughter becoming Steve McQueen in Istanbul in the second one was stupid, like, take that and amplify that 100-fold in the third one. Okay, that's the level of dumb that you're dealing with. Okay, it's just
sold. I'm going to watch this, and there will be a special section. There'll be a special section in next week's podcast where I report back on Taken 3 findings. But also in next week's podcast, we're going to be looking at Academy Award-winning directors making documentaries. So I'm quite looking forward to that. It's people really outside of their wheelhouse. But just final word on Taken. It is ridiculous. And I think so. I watched it with I'd had it was a Friday night. I had a beer in hand. I had some crisps next to me and some. It was just a perfect Friday night movie because it was just so. It was the right level of crap.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there is a very, very weird plot device in it in which Holly Valance turns up. He's shielding Holly Valance at the start, and then his daughter becomes obsessed with Holly Valance. I'm like, why have you got Holly Valance in it? It's just really.
But she's oddly enough, she's not playing Holly Valance. That's the strange thing. She's playing a strange character called She-Ra, and it's like, well, no, if you're going to get Holly Valance, make her Holly Valance. Like, I was sat there singing "Kiss Kiss" to my wife afterwards, just because. Oddly enough, I know the words.
Was that the one where she was in the swimming pool, or was that another one? There was a music video where she was in the swimming pool.
I don't know. I know the song better than the video. I think you probably watched the video without
Yeah,
the
I watched
sound
the
on,
video more than I listened to the song.
whereas I
So-
was listening to the song clearly.
yeah,
But yeah, so moving to next week, we are going to be looking at Academy Award-winning directors who are doing documentaries. If you want to follow a little bit more about Frame to Frame, you can see us on Instagram or on Twitter, Letterboxd, Facebook. You can drop us an email with any sort of theme ideas and just give us some nice feedback. If you want to drop us a review on Podchaser or on Apple Podcasts, we'd be very appreciative, unless it's a negative one, in which case we don't want it. If you want to find out a little bit more about the We Made This podcast network, then all of the information is within the show notes. You can go to the website, which is wemadethisnetwork.com, and you can donate on the Patreon page as well. So please feel free to have a look and see some of the other great shows as part of the network. But until next week, when we are talking about Academy Award-winning directors turning to documentaries, I'm Andy Williams.
and I'm Sean Wilson.
And please continue on listening to hear some of the other great shows on the We Made This podcast network.